So welcome everyone to our program today on voting rights, where we are and the work we have left to do, with Carol Moon Goldberg, who is the president of the League of Women Voters of California. And I'm Laurel Plimier. I'm the president of the League of Women Voters of Piedmont. And as always, I want to thank you for joining us today. And taking a little bit of time out of your day to spend with us here on Zoom and on YouTube. This event is part of a larger Defending Democracy speaker series. And we are thrilled to be launching that series with a discussion today on voting rights. We are fortunate to have a number of local leagues who are also co-sponsoring this series with us. Collier County, Florida, Gunnison Valley, Colorado, Oakland, California, the Pikes Peak region in Colorado, Portland, Oregon, Pueblo, Colorado, Santa Barbara, California, and Solano County, California. So we appreciate your support in co-sponsoring with us, and a big welcome to the members and guests of those leagues who are here with us today. We also have 4 additional events coming up in our Defending Democracy series. Ranked choice voting with Rob Ritchie is on February 10th. Election law in the Supreme Court with Erwin Chemerinsky is on March 1st. International perspective on US democracy with Fiona Hill is on March 30th. And election subversion and disinformation with Rick Hassan on April 4th. And you can find more information about all of those events on our website, which is lwvpiedmont.org/democracy. And before we get to the introduction of our speaker, I just wanted to go over a few logistics. So I'm hoping that most of you are familiar with the Zoom webinar features. If you're in the Zoom call with us, you can post questions for our speaker now or anytime during the presentation with the Q&A feature. And if you're watching on live stream, you can post comments in the YouTube chat. And we should have a few minutes at the end of the program to get through some of those questions. And if you want to use the chat to introduce yourselves and share where you're from, we're excited to have people. We're normally really regional, so we're excited to have people who are maybe outside of the Bay Area with us here today. So feel free to share in chat who you are and where you're coming from, but post questions in the Q&A. And let's see, if you are with us on YouTube or if you're watching the recording, please consider subscribing. And if you click the bell on YouTube, you can get notifications of future live stream events. And if you would like advance notice of our events, please join our mailing list, which you can do on our website. And again, that's lwvpiedmont.org. And you can also become a member of the league there. Your dues alone when you join the league support the grassroots efforts of the league, both locally and at the state and national levels. And if you want to join a local league in your area, if you go to our website and look up the event pages, all of the logos for our co-sponsoring leagues are there, and you can click on one of those logos and it'll take you to that league's site, and you can join that league if that league is in your local area. So the League's efforts in voter education and advocacy are extremely important work, and we greatly appreciate your support. So now I am honored to introduce our speaker for today, Carol Moon Goldberg, who is a member of the League for over 25 years. Carol has served both at the local and state levels prior to her role as president of the League of Women Voters of California. She was the voter service director, where she oversaw production of League of Women Voters of California's standard voter service materials. She worked on Voters Ed. She coordinated the League's part in the televised US senatorial candidate forum. And she also served as program director for LWVC in the reproductive choices portfolio for 3 years prior to joining the state board. So Now I will turn it over to you, Carol. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you for inviting me. When I heard the list of speakers planned, I'm thinking, gosh, I'm just little old me here. So I'm honored to even be like on some sort of brochure with all of those people. Erwin Chemerinsky, who I've been reading for years, and Rick Hasson, same thing. So I'm so impressed and so grateful you asked me to attend. So I hope I don't disappoint. But I welcome everyone and welcome especially to Colorado. I didn't realize you were coming, so some of what I say may be a little California centric, but there is a Colorado link in there, which I will point out. Let me share my screen and let's get going. I always forget that I have to hit slideshow. Here we are. So, voting rights in California and the United States, the challenges of 2022. To give you a little overview of where we're going with this, obviously we're introducing. I'll give you a little history of voting rights in the United States and California, a little discussion of California voting and elections, the Freedom to Vote Act, which is a federal piece of legislation that you might have heard of. Same with the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, and a little discussion about what we can do. So currently in the United States, you may have been hearing about voter suppression and election subversion. Voter suppression is an attempt to limit access to the vote. People have realized you can't just outright deny someone the right to vote if they are eligible to vote, but there are many ways to manipulate the process to make it difficult, onerous, too much trouble to pursue. And we are seeing those things happen. Election subversion, somewhat different. That has to do with the running of the elections, counting of ballots, and the overall complaints about fraud, which lead people to think that maybe there's something wrong with our elections and there's something funny happening with the vote counting. As of the end of 2021, there were 34 bills in 19 states across the country that have somehow restricted access to vote. That's just the ones that were passed. There were over 400 introduced in 2021. Governors in 3 states actually vetoed some legislation like that. And there were many bills that were introduced but won't be acted on until this session, so starting in January and going on. These laws did things like prohibit elections officials or people in general from sending vote by mail applications to people who hadn't asked for them, shortening the deadline for submitting the application or shortening the deadline for submitting the ballot itself, creation of strict and convoluted voter ID requirements, prohibition of drop boxes. And then there are laws that would allow for subversion of elections by allowing partisan state officials the power to change or reject election results, creating legislation that gave partisan state officials the power to seize control of the administration of elections and the vote counting process, and legislation to restrict or control or punish the conduct of election officials. So we are at an interesting stage in our life as a democracy. We thought it would be useful to take a look at voting rights over time. Since America's founding days, voting from the beginning was limited to white male property owners. And that has slowly transformed over the years. The Voting Rights Act of 1965, pretty sweeping reform. And over the time, as you can imagine, the right to vote in US elections has seen change. So in about the 1820s, states started to drop the property qualification requirements, but it still allowed only white men to vote. Then we had the Civil War. We had 3 amendments, the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th that resulted from that. In 1868, the 14th Amendment gave citizenship to those born in the US and to those naturalized citizens who went through the process, whatever the process was at the time. There were, of course, exceptions. Indigenous people were not considered American citizens, even though they were born here and were here first. They were considered citizens of their tribes. Chinese exclusion acts, not just in California, but nationally, were in effect back in that time. In 1870, the 15th Amendment established that race, color, or previous condition of servitude could not be the basis for denying someone the right to vote. As we moved into the 1920s, yay, the 19th Amendment was passed and women were allowed to vote, but that still didn't solve much in the way of a problem. You had Jim Crow laws that were created starting back during the Reconstruction era and continued and perfected throughout this time. It wasn't until 1924 that Indigenous people were considered American citizens. It wasn't until 1943 that the Chinese Exclusion Act was repealed. And finally, one of the components of Jim Crow laws, poll taxes, was prohibited by the 24th Amendment. That didn't pass until 1964. Then we get to the time we all remember or have learned about, the 1965 Voting Rights Act. After a very long battle, a lot of blood was shed, protest, complaints, television coverage of things that I think Americans were a little shocked at, helped provide the impetus for creation of the Voting Rights Act. Part of the Voting Rights Act included what we call Section 2, which you may have heard referred to as a pre-clearance provision. That law made places, states, counties even, with a history of voting discrimination, you had to get federal approval before they changed any of their voting laws first. That was based on past discrimination. You probably heard about it very recently. In 2013, the US Supreme Court in the Shelby case basically said, we don't have discrimination anymore and there's no reason to enforce this. And so it basically pulled that provision out of the Voting Rights Act so that it's no longer useful. I will point out in the 1980s, the Voting Rights Act was extended for 25 years and again in the early 2000s. And back in 1982, there were also provisions added to provide for language access for those whose first language was not English, disability access so that people can get to the polls and actually vote. Also, you may remember in 1997, if you're an old league member like me, the National Voter Registration Act was passed. The LWV US was quite excited by this and supported it. That's what we call the motor voter bill, and that allowed for registration through departments of motor vehicles. And then in 2002, we had the HAVA Act, which is the Help America Vote Act. That was the result of the recounting and controversy over the 2000 presidential election and the election returns in Florida. It provided money for the states to upgrade their elections equipment. Remember, those were the days where we learned about hanging chads and things like that. Which, by the way, California, when I moved here in 1985, I was shocked to learn that it was using that system because I used to live in Tennessee, a much smaller, less financially well-off state, and they were using that system. So I was very, very shocked to see that. So that's a very short trip through voting rights nationally. California's system had a similar path. Even though California was technically admitted as a free state back in 1850, the Constitution of California, the original one, allowed only white men to vote. When the Civil War amendments came about, the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th, California really wasn't interested in ratifying them. I don't think they didn't ratify the 13th Amendment until actually it had been ratified by 3/4 of the states and was officially part of the federal Constitution. They never got around to voting on the 14th Amendment for years. And the 15th Amendment was actually voted down by the California state legislature. Also through this time, California had a sort of poll tax. It wasn't strictly administered as one, but it was linked to voter registrations. California started a voter registration scheme in the late 1880s, like a lot of states did. And this scheme was pretty strict. It required people to register, people meaning men, to register every 2 years in person at the county seat. If a person did not vote in a single election, the person was bumped off the voter rolls. Very, very strict. That was difficult. It was eventually removed by a ballot initiative, but not until 1930. 1930, Californians actually voted for what we call a permanent registration system, which means that once you're registered, you are registered unless you move or change your name, in which case you need to re-register, as we preach to everybody all the time. In 1911, finally, women were allowed to vote, but not Chinese. As I mentioned before, the Chinese exclusion laws didn't get repealed until 1943. But slowly over time, particularly in the 40s and the 50s, voting laws, registration laws loosened up and became more accessible to individuals. They actually allowed voter registration material to be in places like post offices in the early 60s. In 1961, for the first time, the law loosened up enough to allow a group like the League of Women Voters to actually run voter registration drives. Up until that point, only elections officials could do that, and they probably didn't bother to do it very much. So slowly, in the 60s, things got a little bit looser, at least here in California. So let me turn to California very briefly and talk about what we have now. Given the backdrop of moving from pretty restrictive white men only, register in person or forget it, poll taxes sometimes, and publishing information only in English when many people in the 1880s and even the early 1900s weren't very educated. It couldn't even read English a lot of times. So what we currently have in California is voter registration online at all times. Online includes registration at the Department of Motor Vehicles and also same-day registration, so that a person on election day can appear registered to vote and cast at least a provisional ballot. This is a big step. Same-day registration is really important for a very mobile population that sometimes California has. It's important for people who do not have regular places to live or who have to wander and move a lot because they are basically unhoused. It's important for brand new voters who don't understand the concept of registration. And in the past, when you had to register 30 days or 15 days before election day, so many people didn't know that. So they showed up at a polling place and were told they couldn't vote. So this takes care of that problem. And I think it's a very important thing that is done to allow eligible voters to go ahead and vote, which is the foundation of our democracy. Representation based on the consent of the voters. That's what we're here for. So the voters need a voice, and allowing them to vote and register on the same day is a way of giving them that voice. Voters now can check their registration online. This all strikes me as very miraculous, but it's pretty amazing. You can check your registration. You can make sure the date or your address is correct. You can, I don't know, figure out what party you're registered for if you did that. You can change it online. Really easy to do. Registration now includes the Department of Motor Vehicles. There has been, and I will discuss this in a minute, a lot of back and forth. It was an inefficient and not well followed policy and procedure. It's getting to be much better now. And that's important because that is a place where people will go. That's their first point of contact when they're a 15-and-a-half-year-old and want to get a learner's permit, or 16 or 18 when they want to apply for a driver's license. When we move, probably the DMV is like one place that we always make sure that we inform them of a new address. So that's important that people can access it through the Department of Motor Vehicles. California also has extensive use of vote by mail ballots. That was first instituted, well, even back in the Civil War days, there was some provision for soldiers to be able to vote in their home states. California, back in 1979, dropped any requirement that someone must explain why they need to vote absentee. And so other states, and I think there are still 16 states across the country, still require you to state a reason, and they allow only certain reasons for someone to access an absentee ballot, and they use that term absentee. We have noticed since we moved from absentee ballot to the phrase vote by mail ballot, we're not sure if there's a correlation, but certainly the use of vote by mail ballots has increased since 1979. And maybe the theory is that because it says vote by mail, people actually understand what that is. Oh, you vote, you put it in the mail, as opposed to absentee. What is that? I'm away from school. What does that mean? So I think that even a name change like that, very subtle, has an impact on voter behavior. So it's important to think about the words we use and the titles that we give to things. In 2001, California allowed voters to declare themselves permanent vote by mail voters, so that they receive a ballot in the mail 30 days before an election every year without having to fill out an application and make a specific request for a specific election. Over time, we have seen the number of permanent vote by mail ballot voters increase because people value the convenience and they like the ability to do that. I will point out in March 2020, the primary election, that was roughly March 3rd, before the stay in place orders were coming down to us, 78% of all the ballots cast in the California primary in March 2020 were vote by mail. That's how popular it is. And that's perhaps why we don't have a huge outcry here in California about using vote by mail, is that people are accustomed to using it and it's quite popular. That's what we hope. Vote by mail enabled some early voting simply because you could return the ballot very quickly through the return mail. And eventually we adopted in some states, in some counties, we adopted what we called the Voters' Choice Act. Starting in 2018, a total of 5 counties in the state of California decided to enter a pilot program with this system, which involved sending vote by mail ballots to all registered voters in the county, which involved creating voting centers rather than lots of polling places spread across the county, but defined discrete polling centers or voting centers, which were basically mini elections offices. So the voting center was a place to replace your ballot if you marked it and didn't like what you marked, or you spilled coffee on it, or whatever. It was a place to go to ask questions and get real answers. At the same time, we created drop boxes that were scattered throughout the county so that people could, rather than use post office, drop their ballots in those drop boxes. And that all came as a result of the Voters' Choice Act. And here's the Colorado connection. The city of Denver, I remember in particular, when our Secretary of State here in California went to the city of Denver to watch that system, the system I just described, work in Denver. And he and others were very impressed with it, including legislators. And it's part of the reason why we do have this Voters' Choice Act, which is still available to people. Through the years, we have defined and developed language and disability access so that those who struggle reading or struggle with English as a second language will be able to get in-language help. We are working hard to try to make sure all materials from the very beginning, the first contact with the voter, is in the appropriate language. We're also concerned about disability access, making sure not only that you're abiding by the Americans with Disability Act, the Federal Legislation Access Act, but also to make sure we have equipment, machinery, even comfortable tables and chairs, if that's what we need in a vote location, so that people can cast their vote, so that there are no barriers to them being able to do it. We've had early voting through vote by mail, and now through the Voters' Choice Act, and through the system that we used in November 2020 for that last election. Another thing that people don't think about in terms of suppression of votes or subversion of elections is gerrymandering. That is a way of rendering certain groups or certain people's votes pretty insignificant. So even if they cast a ballot in every single election, the composition within the district they live in basically means they have no chance to really influence the ultimate winner of an election, and that is a problem. So California pioneered the California Citizens Redistricting Commission, which has just finished its second ever redistricting process. And about 2 years ago, in effect now for the first time, is the Fair Maps Act, which is California law setting up criteria for redistricting for cities and counties. And this redistricting cycle is the first time that the components of that act have come into play. And so we find that exciting and interesting. And again, it's a way to make sure that voters' voices are heard, not gerrymandered into insignificance. So I was asked to talk about some league success stories. I mentioned that National League supported the Motor Voter Act very much, was in support of the HABA Act. I wanted to look at California in particular. League advocacy wins, the Citizens Redistricting Commission, a huge win. Same-day registration, we pushed for that, advocated for that. It was actually passed in 2008, but until we had a competent voter roll, electronically stable voter roll, we weren't able to use it until just recently. Registration at the Department of Motor Vehicles. The League and other groups in coalition engaged in really careful work on this. There was some litigation with the state over the way it was done, the way registration was handled. We wanted to make sure that AB 60 license holders, which are undocumented residents who can hold driver's licenses in California, were not accidentally registered, which would subject them to penalties and unwanted attention. So now, over time, the laws are now in sync with what we litigated over. And this just happened last year, so we're very happy about that. I mentioned the Fair Maps Act. We've also supported, as you recall, in 2020, the Proposition 17 restoration of voting rights to those people who are on parole. They are no longer incarcerated. Many times they are in schools, they're holding down jobs. It was time for them to return to voting. When the pandemic struck in 2020, the League of Women Voters of California received a phone call from the Secretary of State's office saying, come, meet with us, brainstorm with us, let's figure out how we can run the November 2020 election. Fortunately, the primary election was behind us, and that was run under the normal system, and there were plenty of months to sort of create a system that worked well for California in November 2020. And during that time, and ever since then, the League made it clear that ensuring that every active registered voter gets a ballot in the mail is something that is supportive. It's something that is very good for voting access. But we also know that getting a ballot in the mail isn't the end of the story. And so we lobbied heavily to make sure that there were robust, safe, in-person voting options for many communities, especially those that have been historically disenfranchised. The statement that is made by going to a voting center or a polling place and voting is a very important symbolic move to them. We also see that in young voters. They want to do that. They want to have that experience. And so we want to make sure that they have physical locations to vote in. We're also concerned that people need help sometimes with their ballots. They need a new one. They need explanations in their own languages. They need some sort of disability access that you can't get just by handling a piece of paper and filling in a dot. Sometimes that just doesn't work for people. We also find in underrepresented communities in California, if they're not familiar with the vote by mail process, the ability to take a ballot to a voting location and ask questions actually leads to a reduction in the number of errors. in marking the ballot, in not signing it, all of the reasons that can get a ballot kicked out and not counted. The education process and the ability to get one-on-one help in a voting center has helped a lot to reduce that. Also, we learned in 2020 there were a lot of people displaced by wildfires, and so vote by mail, if we could find the right place for them, if they could access a vote center in their community to get a ballot, that enabled them to vote as well. So the League also in the last year has spearheaded the refinement of rules about electioneering around vote centers and polling places. There is a new law that will be taking effect this year that prohibits electioneering within 100 feet of a polling place, but the definition of polling place has expanded to the outside of the building that a polling location may be in, as opposed to like some room inside a building. It also includes drop boxes because we have found that there were obstructions of drop boxes and yelling and campaigning through there. We also, as part of that law, urged the rules about unofficial drop boxes to be made clear, to make it clear that perhaps those who collect ballots for delivery to an elections office at a, say, an assisted living facility, that sort of innocent, not intending to interfere with anybody's ballot, should not be punished. However, misrepresenting a box as an official box with intent to mislead voters, that is something that should be punishable. So we managed to get a lot of that done. There's still work to be done. Voter education is huge. We learned in November 2020, particularly when vote by mail was new and there was all sorts of bad information flying around and fears about the post office not delivering anything. Voter education was key. And what we would really, really like to see as an organization is for the state budget, the Secretary of State's budget, somebody's budget, to include plenty of money so that voters can be educated about how to handle this, about what a ballot is, what they're voting on in plain language and in whatever languages people need to help them understand and consciously cast a ballot in a meaningful way. So that's a big effort that we're going to put in probably forever, is to keep asking for money for that. So how do we do this? And this is just the voting legislation. The LWVC has spoken on over 70 bills in the last year, and all sorts of areas, not just good government areas and election related laws, but in things related to climate change and housing and education, criminal justice, racial justice, all of those things. Part of the way we do this is that we have a large group, and it could be larger. So if you're interested, listen up. A large group of volunteer people who are either experts or have developed expertise over time following bills in certain categories, providing analysis for us so that we can understand what they are and if these bills maybe fit within the positions that the League of Women Voters of California has developed over the years and fit within the priorities that were set as a result of convention and as a result of the work of our overarching legislative committee, which reviews those analyses and makes recommendations and decides what the League will support, whether the League will perhaps co-sponsor something, which involves bird dogging a bill through the entire legislative process. That is to be contrasted with just sending a letter to a committee every once in a while, supporting or opposing something. So it's a very big, convoluted process. Here in California, we have one registered lobbyist on our staff, and that person is supported by a public policy fellow. We call it the Trudy Schaefer Public Policy Fellow. Trudy Schaefer was a very long time advocate and lobbyist for the League of Women Voters. I think she did this job for us for over 25 years and represented our organization really well and thought that it was so important that we develop future people, not just to lobby, but to be able to work in government. whether it's for a legislative committee as an expert or run for office someday, whatever they want to do. So those two are like the people that get paid to do this. The rest is all volunteer work, and it's important work. So that's where we've been successful. Now let's go back to standards. Let's look at the federal law here. As I talked about the history of voting rights, I was hoping that you would notice that until the federal government gets involved, individual states create their own discriminatory rules that had the impact of preventing people from voting, or making it harder for them to vote, or reducing the significance of their vote because of gerrymandering their districts. It seems that it took 3 amendments to the US Constitution after the Civil War to at least establish a right to vote among a certain number of people, and to set up a cause of action to help people complain if they are being prevented from voting because of their race, color of their skin, or condition of previous servitude, as we say. And then we had Jim Crow, a number of things. Places like California loosened up, other places didn't change much. And finally, the Voting Rights Act in 1965 came and created a sea change that helped a large number of people work. The reason for that is because aggrieved people, the people who are being suppressed and subverted, have somewhere outside of the state to go to for legal remedy and for help. And the fact that the federal law creates standards, it also helps standardize behavior across the states. And that's important for something as vital and basic as the right to vote. So we're at the point again where we need some federal legislation and federal help in defining the right to vote, how access is allowed, all of those things. So what we have is called the Freedom to Vote Act that was introduced in September. It grew out of sort of the For the People Act, which was actually originally introduced in 2019, was reintroduced in 2021 through one of the US senators who thought it was too big. A small group of senators rewrote that act and called it the Freedom to Vote Act. By the way, our former Secretary of State and now US Senator Alex Padilla was part of that committee, and I suspect had a lot to do with this. So the point of the Freedom to Vote Act is to protect and expand the right to vote, to decrease the influence of money in politics, and to curb partisan gerrymandering, and something else I will add on in a minute. The thought is that national standards for voting, for access to voting, is important for voters to understand what their rights are and how to exercise them, to set up a standard by which all systems are examined, and to set sort of a minimum basic standard for people. So these national standards include things like no excuse vote by mail for eligible voters. It includes same-day voter registration, automatic voter registration, which is probably in connection with the Department of Vehicles in a lot of states. That can be either an opt-in system or an opt-out system. Want to protect and expand access to vote by mail, want to expand early voting to 15 days, including at least 2 weekends, and restores voting rights to individuals who have been previously incarcerated. The idea is that establishing these clear, enforceable national standards, it helps deprive partisans of the discretion to suppress and discard legitimate votes. It also deprives people of the raw material that underlies the kinds of claims of fraud that we have heard across the country over a number of times. It enables elections officials to say, look, we followed the federal rule. This is the way it works, and this is what we did. The Freedom to Vote Act also addresses redistricting, partisan gerrymandering by setting up criteria for the line drawing. It doesn't set up independent commissions like California has, but it does set up criteria for line drawing that excludes the home address of incumbents in the districts, excludes actually consideration of political party at all. It includes consideration of communities of interest and things like that, the things that we have in California. In addition, there are some financial disclosure acts. Well, we call it the Disclose Act. It's called Disclose is an acronym. The Democracy is Strengthened by Casting Light on Spending in Elections Act. I don't know how much time went into creating that name, but it comes out to disclose. So that's what we will do. We'll call it Disclose Act. It requires organizations that spend money in federal elections. Groups like labor organizations, super PACs, general corporations, to disclose their donors. This will allow the American people to see who is attempting to sway their votes and gain influence in the government and have a larger voice in the government than we with our little one person, one vote can have. The Freedom to Vote Act also has provisions to help protect against subversion of elections. It sets up some standards that protect elections officials, that will keep them from getting removed from their offices unless there's proof of malfeasance or gross negligence in the conduct of their office, and gives them recourse to federal court outside of the state system, but federal court, in order to contest any sort of discharge or being drummed out of office. It regulates poll watcher behavior, hopefully to protect elections officials from intimidation and coercion. And it bars laws that would prevent the sending of vote by mail applications to people that have not requested them. That is something that has been done across states. It's some of the legislation that was passed. And this would prevent punishment of elections officials from sending these things out. It also sets up protection of ballots and election equipment by setting rules for retaining the paper, who holds them, how long it's being held, and creates penalties for the mishandling or destroying of ballots and voting equipment. The bill also provides for some money to help states that need it get new up-to-date elections equipment, hopefully with a voter verified paper trail, which is important, instead of just straight electronic with no way for the voter to look and see for sure what they voted for. Now, this bill will be seen in conjunction with the John Lewis Voting Rights Amendment Act. I mentioned in the beginning that the Voting Rights Act had Section 2, which required pre-clearance of any voting law changes in jurisdictions that had a pattern and a history of discriminating against racial groups. And that was gutted by the Shelby decision in 2013. That turned out to be a disaster for voting rights. We saw immediately an uptick in voter ID rules, in purging of voter rolls, other regressive laws. And so this particular bill would prevent the changes to voting rules that do discriminate on the basis of race or membership in language minority groups from being implemented. And it gives those groups access to the federal courts to challenge those things. This is essentially restoring Section 2 to the Voting Rights Act. I will note that 3 of the 4 really restrictive laws that were enacted would be subject to pre-clearance under the John Lewis Act. That would be the laws that are in Florida, Georgia, and Texas, which we've all heard about. They're huge bills that change lots of things. So the hope is that the combination of these 2 bills will provide stability and preserve access to voting and preserve the ability of discriminated against groups to get recourse and to move forward so that they can actually be true, full citizens of the United States. So what can we do in terms of the federal legislation, those 2 bills in particular? LWV US, the United States League of Women Voters, is supporting these bills, has been doing it consistently from the time they were called the For the People Act, and continues to do so. The organization of the League is part of 230 organizations that are part of this Declaration for American Democracy. That is a strong coalition of groups, all sorts of groups from all over, that are all supportive of the Freedom to Vote Act. This organization has been spearheading the national lobbying efforts. They have been helping to stage things like protests outside the White House, which you may have heard about if you're a league member and have seen material from LWVUS about the executive director of the league being arrested. That's happened a number of times. I think there have been 4 of them total. Each successive one has been a little bit bigger, more people, more organizations appearing. Some people might say it's sort of political theater, but the thought behind it is that Washington, D.C. is cut off from the rest of us. And they really, for some reason, really thought that infrastructure bills and all of that stuff were the only things that they had to think about. And we wanted to make sure that they knew, no, we care about this too. We don't just care about pocketbook issues. We care about access to vote. We care about the right to vote and preserving that right. And so that was the point of all of this. The League of Women Voters US has consistently lobbied the senators in the states that might have a senator they think might be waffling and might want to vote for this. Been working hard on that. You all have seen action alerts or requests to join a tweet storm and ask for a passage of the Freedom to Vote Act and saying things like, this is no time to recess and voting rights now and all of those things. It's all part of trying to build a public pressure on these pretty isolated people in the Supreme Court. I'm sorry, in the state capitol and then in the federal Capitol building to listen to us, the people, not just the people with money, but us, the people. So this organization, the Declaration for American Democracy, if you look at the page here, you'll see the word events on the left. That is a place you can click on that and you can see all sorts of activities that perhaps you can participate in. It could be postcard writing to West Virginia voters or phone calling to Georgia voters. A number of things, even the vigils that were held in honor of 1/6 last week, you would be able to find those there. These are all things that you as individuals can do to help. Take a look at the list. If you feel so moved, you don't have to do these things. The idea is to make sure that the people in Washington know there's a groundswell of support for these 2 acts. What we do in California, even in a place like California, and we look pretty good, really. And you realize the For the People Act and the Freedom to Vote Act have provisions that are basically the ones that we use here in California. This is good. It doesn't mean that there aren't bills introduced to the California state legislature that would try to reverse this or change it or limit it in some ways. They do happen from time to time. Many of them don't make it out of committee. In fact, none of them have made it out of committee as far as I know. There may be ballot initiatives out there being circulated for signature that might want to change this. Excuse me. So be aware of this. Be aware that these things are happening. We're also seeing across the state, not a huge swell, but a certain number of county elections officials who are being challenged and intimidated and perhaps even driven from office by complaints and threats about past election and whatever else might happen. If you become aware of these things, please drop me an email. Let us know. The League in California is part of a coalition of other good government groups that want to keep track of this, sort of track it, can try to put it in a central clearinghouse so we can see if there's a pattern of behavior or if they're the same people doing it just in different parts of the state. Anyway, it's all part of sort of staying on top of it all. So anything about that, have seen things, let me know. I really appreciate that. What else can you do? You can support the League of Women Voters of California by offering your time if you're interested in being a legislative analyst. If you have expertise in a particular area or a strong interest in digging into it, it is time consuming, but it's really rewarding, particularly if you care about the issue. And that's part of League work, is caring about the issues and not just caring about voter education. You can help the League financially by supporting the Trudy Schaefer Public Policy Fellowship. It was created in honor of Trudy Schaefer, who passed away a couple of years ago, and is designed to support people who are interested in government service, and we have about one a year. They get a great education, and they help the league by giving the league sometimes a younger face or a different looking face than old me here. So please support us financially in every other way. We do get a piece of your dues paid, but it's a pretty small piece, and it doesn't pay for everything that we need to do. And finally, please continue your voting education work. With misinformation and disinformation floating around out there, the best antidote is to have good, accurate, plain language explanations for vote by mail ballots, for what the offices that they're being asked to choose people for do and how they work. All of that is so important, and so important to reduce the rumor mill and the suspicion that people have, because you can give them good, solid information. So you are done with me. I thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to answer what questions I can. And if I can't, I can look up answers for you in the future.
Thank you so much, Carol. We're not done with you yet. We have a few minutes left, and I hope you'll answer a few questions before we are out of time. Sure. One question, and this is, so you mentioned all of the advocacy work that the California League has done on voting rights in our state legislature. Is there any coordination among other leagues in other states with their people who are on the ground doing advocacy and lobbying work, so that perhaps those leagues could take a page out of League of Women Voters of California book and some of the successes that you've had?
Well, we are happy to help. There's no formal network for that, and a lot of times leagues operate through LWVUS, which keeps track of this in all 50 states. And so I have, like, on occasion gotten calls from the president of the Arizona League, that comes to mind immediately, about things that were done or have been done here. It's a very informal network, and we're certainly happy to help out in any way we can. As I said, the Freedom to Vote Act, if it were enacted, covers a whole lot of what we already do. So hopefully, if it were to pass, that would really lighten the load on leagues across the state. And by the way, fortunately, we've not had to do this, but across the state, leagues across the country, leagues have challenged some of these laws. With the aid and support of LWVUS. There's a lot of states that are in litigation right now over this stuff.
So some people in California believe that our recall process is a way of potentially subverting the will of the voters. Is the California League involved in advocating for election reform around our California recall laws?
We want to be involved in that, and we want to be involved further than just dealing with the governor's race. There are a couple of proposals out there, but we're also thinking, and there are other groups like Common Cause that we are in coalition with many times, that are concerned about local recall elections and wanting to look at the rules for that to see if there is some. I mean, if we're reforming recall, we might as well do it all. So League is definitely interested in that. We're pursuing it. We've been asked by the Secretary of State, who has created some commission to work on that, the Little Hoover Commission. I mean, there are different groups sort of still researching, trying to find like the best way to do it. So we haven't settled on one solid thing yet. There are lots of possibilities out there, and we want to pick the best one. And that may take time for consensus on that to evolve, but we are certainly not ignoring it. We think it's very important.
You may not have personal knowledge about this, but I'm hoping you might be able to speak about it a little bit with your relationship with LWVUS. So do you know if they are keeping tabs on the state legislation in other, across the 50 states that is being introduced to restrict voting rights, or if that is just a state league by state league effort?
The state leagues are watching it and reporting it to the National League, and litigation is usually coordinated through the National League. And so they have a whole division that deals with litigation. It's important to make sure that, say, the league in Pennsylvania is not arguing something that's contradictory to what the league in Florida is arguing. And so it's important that the National League is sort of the clearinghouse for that and is making sure it's all consistent. They also can help us with finding public interest law firms that are interested in doing this work for us, because obviously we can't pay $1,000 an hour for this kind of work, but there are groups that do it pro bono. And so National League is very important in helping link us up with those sorts of groups.
Do you have any suggestions for people who live in a state with higher voter protections as far as what they could do to support? I mean, I guess you mentioned some of it in your presentation, but what people from out of state can do to help other states that are struggling with voting restrictions?
The best thing to do is look at that website for the Declaration for American Democracy. They've listed lots of opportunities, and they're not necessarily restricted by state. But we do know, voices from outside the state don't necessarily help 100%, because legislators need to hear from their constituents, because they don't feel responsible to those of us in California. But there is a lot of phone calling, postcard writing, that sort of thing that can be done. And you will find it on that website under events.
And I did post the link to that website in chat, and I've also put it in the YouTube live stream for the folks who are watching over there.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. So we have about 2 minutes left, and I do want to be mindful of the time. I had one question that I wanted all of our speakers to answer. I feel like you've already answered it, like you had read my mind, which was, what is the most important concrete step that each of us can take to protect our democracy? So maybe if you could answer that, not just like go to this website and take some action there, but sort of a concrete step that can inspire us as people who are engaged in defending democracy.
A concrete step: be involved and be the model for an involved, active citizen. And so that means stay in touch. That means do the things like I said on the website. It means working through your league with voter education so that people can understand. I find league members, we're so used to thinking about it that we start to take for granted that everyone knows what to do. Reach out to other organizations that maybe consist of mostly underrepresented groups in the state of California, and see if there's a way to work together with them, because we're a majority minority state, but still the bulk of people who vote in the state of California are white people over the age of 65, and we are not the majority in this state anymore. So, and reach out to young people. This is their future, and maybe voting rights doesn't get them excited, but climate change, I'm finding, motivates a lot of people. So just be the model of an active, engaged citizen, and that is something we can all do. It's useful, and I think we have to practice what we preach.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. We are at the top of the hour. I really appreciate all of the information. This was like a primer course on voting rights. I'm hoping that you'd be willing to share your slides so that we can post them for people. And thank you for taking the time to be with us. Thank you to everyone who joined us. Feel free to share the link of the recording if you're watching it on YouTube with friends and family who couldn't attend today. And thank you again.